Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 104 online, and today we're going to be talking about the beginnings of the Renaissance in Renaissance Europe. Now, it was a time when trade and finance were disrupted, where prices and wages fluctuated wildly and unpredictably all over Europe, and the Renaissance was a time of social insurrections. There were insurrections in England, in France, and in many Italian towns, particularly in Florence. Now, the period after about 1300 may be viewed in several quite different ways. Is this the waning of the Middle Ages? Should our interpretive categories emphasize decline, disruption, and despair? Is this the dawn of a new era? Should we see initiative, originality, and creativity? In fact, both views have been prevalent. In this lecture, we must try to understand the basic contours of the 14th and 15th centuries so that in the next lectures, we'll have context and perspective for understanding the Renaissance. Now, certain broad trends are clearly visible in this era, in particular in political and institutional history. The basic trends evident in 1300 persisted through the period. Where centralization or fragmentation were present, they did not change much. And the single great fact of the age was the Hundred Years' War between France and England. Now, this was, on the whole, a period of disastrous problems for the Church. The great facts of the period were the Babylonian captivity of the papacy and the Great Schism. There was also anti-clericalism and limited efforts at reform. At the same time, ordinary people showed signs of deep religious faith, and the most dramatic developments of the period were the demographic and economic problems associated with the Black Death. So let's first look at the overall political shape of Europe. The Hundred Years' War was the all but inevitable outcome of the long-standing enmity between France and England occasioned by the continental interests of the English kings. In 1340, Edward III of England claimed the throne of France through his wife and opened a war that lasted until 1453. Now, it was an odd war. There were only three major campaigns. Bands of freebooters rampaged in France, and Joan of Arc rallied the French in 1429-31 after the Treaty of Troyes nearly gave France to England. Now, the English won all the great battles and at times held much of France, but finally lost the war and retained only a little area near Calais. The war had important consequences for both France and England. For the French, the war heightened the sense of national consciousness, professionalized the military, generalized several forms of taxation, and restored royal prestige. For England, the war enhanced the role of Parliament through the principle of redress before supply, meaning you have to ask for money before you can supply the army. It diverted royal attention from pressing problems at home, and created deep factional divides in the aristocracy that culminated in a civil war known as the War of the Roses, which lasted from 1455 to 1489. Now, much of Europe was drawn into war in one way or another, and trade was seriously disrupted. In Iberia, we may take 1492 as a vantage point on developments in the late Middle Ages. In January, a crusading army entered Granada, and the last Muslim stronghold fell to the centuries-long Reconquista. In March, Ferdinand and Isabella issued a decree requiring the Jews of Castile and Aragon to convert or depart. Now, this ended centuries of rich Jewish-Muslim-Christian interaction in Spain. Shortly after, in April, Isabella commissioned Christopher Columbus to discover and acquire islands and mainlands in the ocean sea, a development that initiated the globalization of Western civilization. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 laid the foundation for a unification of Iberia, a realm where crown and nobility, abetted by the Church, had been building effective government for 3 centuries. Now, in Italy, the basic tripartite scheme remained in place. German control in the north grew progressively weaker, and in 1494 the French invaded, albeit without lasting consequences. The great development in the north was the rise of Milan, Florence, and Venice as key and competing powers. The papacy's control of the center was severely compromised by the papal absence in Avignon, and the south was hotly contested by France and Spain, but not effectively controlled by either. Now, German development is riddled with paradoxes. The Golden Bull of 1356 might have created a stable federal regime. Instead, it built a framework for continuing fragmentation. Individual territories in Germany were often prosperous, peaceful, and well governed, and there simply was no effective central government. Along Europe's eastern frontier, there were three major developments. Lithuania and Poland coalesced into a powerful, stable kingdom. Russians, centered on the Grand Duchy of Moscow, threw off the Mongols and began to unite a huge swath of lands. And in 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. This consolidated their position as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, ecclesiastical affairs may be more briefly summarized. In 1305, a Frenchman, Clement V, was elected pope in the hope that he might settle the long-running dispute with the King of France. He settled on papal property in Avignon, and his successors remained there until 1378. Europe was divided in allegiance. The absence of the popes from Rome scandalized many. Writers spoke of the Babylonian captivity. Now, attempts to restore the papacy to Rome resulted in the Great Schism, a period from 1378 to 1417, when two and sometimes three men claimed to be the legitimate pope. Scholars began to define conciliarism, a doctrine that claimed that ultimate authority in the church resided in councils, not in the papacy. And some churchmen called for frequent councils, while popes tried to subvert them. Now, challenges for the official church did not bespeak a decline of religious sentiment. Such writers as Chaucer were humorously anti-clerical, but still conventionally pious. The modern devotion, which arose in the Netherlands, was a powerful movement of spiritual renewal for lay people that produced bestsellers such as Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. Now, there were large-scale heretical movements, too, that challenged both the authority and the teachings of the church. The most powerful were the Lollards in England, who took their rise from John Wycliffe and the Hussites in Bohemia, the followers of Jan Hus, which we'll look at these figures probably later. Now, records indicate huge numbers of pilgrims and many examples of lay piety, such as the Rosary. The most devastating crisis of the age was caused by plague. A series of seasons of bad weather, poor harvests, and famines between 1315 and 1322 weakened Europe severely and put an end to the expansion of the preceding centuries. The Black Death was a savage outbreak of bubonic plague, the first in 600 years, brought to Europe from the Black Sea region of Genoese merchants. Now, the 1348 to 49 outbreak was serious, but the plague kept coming back, beginning in 1363 and lasting until the 18th century. Now, the consequences of the plague were many and complex. Mortality rates were tremendous, 25% to 35% overall, while young and productive urbanites most vulnerable. There was widespread anxiety, hysteria, and depression, and these conditions manifested themselves in appalling attacks on Jews. Trade and finance were disrupted, prices and wages fluctuated wildly. Social insurrections occurred in England, France, and Florence. Recovery did not come until the age of European imperial expansion. Renaissance Europe was a difficult place in time. So what then was this Renaissance? Now, the Renaissance began as an urban phenomenon, as a communal phenomenon. Then, very quickly, it became princely and courtly. In other words, it moved from the city to the court, and it moved from an urban setting to a royal and princely setting. So, what is the Renaissance problem? Doesn't everyone know that after a millennium of darkness and despair, Europe awakened in a blaze of glory? As always, the answer is not quite so simple. Our discussion or division of Western civilization, ancient, modern, or ancient, medieval, and modern, is itself a product of a particular time and place, not an eternal truth. Now, as we saw in discussing the transformation of the Roman world, people were unaware of any abrupt change. Charlemagne's friend Alcuin spoke of a new Rome rising in Francia that was finer than the Rome of old because the old one was absorbed Athens, but the new one had added Jerusalem. This interpretation, first of all, does not yield pride of place to the ancients, and second, evinces continuity. In the 12th century, Bernard of Chartres said, "We are as dwarfs seated on the soldiers or the shoulders of giants, that we might see more further than they, yet not in virtue of the keenness of our eyesight, nor the breadth of our vision, but alone because we are raised aloft on that giant mass." Now note again the sense of superiority to the ancients and the sense of continuity. The idea was that there had been a serious change somewhere in what we might call the late Middle Ages. The label goes back to a 17th century figure named Christophe Kelder. Now consider these words of Matteo Palmieri around 1430. Where was the painter's art until Giotto restored it? A caricature of the art of human delineation. Sculpture and architecture for long years sunk to the mere travesty of art, and only today in the process of the rescue from obscurity. Only now are they being brought to a new pitch of perfection by men of genius and erudition. Of letters and liberal studies, it would be better to be silent altogether. For these, the real guises of distinction in all the arts, the solid foundation of all civilization, have been lost to mankind for 800 years and more. It is but in our own day that men dare to boast that they see the dawn of better things. For example, we owe it to our Leonardo Bruni that Latin, so long a byword of its uncouthness, has begun to shine forth in its ancient purity, its beauty, its majestic rhythm. Now indeed, may every thoughtful spirit thank God that it has been permitted to him to be born in this new age so full of hope and promise, which already rejoices in a greater array of nobly gifted souls than the world has seen in 1,000 years that have preceded it. Now, far to the north in France, Francois Rabelais agreed. He said, "Out of the thick Gothic night our eyes were awakened to the glorious light of the sun." Now, such views tell us a lot about the men who held them, but not necessarily much at all about history. Erwin Panofsky, the great art historian, said that in the 14th century people looked back at from a fixed point in time. Now, the word Rinascita was first used by Giorgio Vasari in the middle of the 16th century in his History of Painters. The very word Renaissance has had somewhat varied fortunes. Protestant reformers applauded Renaissance attacks on the Catholic Church, but disliked what they saw as hedonism and rationalism. In the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, there was a tendency to draw lines too sharply between medieval superstition and Renaissance rationalism. For the Romantics, there was an aesthetic appreciation of Renaissance art, but also a certain regret at the perceived rationalism that supposedly suppressed the natural man. Now, the first great modern attempt to recapture a sense of the era came with Jacob Burckhardt's Civilization of Renaissance in Italy. Now, it has been much easier to say just what issues come under the heading of Renaissance. Usually, Renaissance is associated with humanism, but this term can mean several things. Love and concern of human beings, as in Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, a preoccupation with this world and its concern, as in Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, a devotion to the humane disciplines, the liberal arts, but not presumably theology, a particular fascination with the literary culture of classical antiquity, civic humanism either as boosterism or as republicanism. So why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Now, Italy had been economically precocious in the Middle Ages, but otherwise major developments occurred in the north. One might have expected France to take the lead because it had been culturally dominant since the 12th century. There was a higher level of literacy and lay education in Italy. Italians felt themselves more directly heirs of the Romans than anyone else could or did. There was even greater wealth in Italy that provided for patronage and leisure to enjoy the arts. Italian society was less bound to feudal and chivalric values than the North, and one might compare Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with Boccaccio's Decameron. Now, given that it began in Italy, how and why did the Renaissance spread? Now, Italians traveled in the north. They searched for manuscripts and sometimes hired out as teachers and courtiers. Northerners traveled in Italy. By the late 15th century, scholars commonly made tours of Italy, and with the 16th century, painters began to follow. The development of printing made it possible for ideas to circulate much more quickly, cheaply, and efficiently than ever before. Now, the Renaissance began as an urban and communal phenomenon, but quickly became princely and courtly. Renaissance culture became fashionable. Civilité, defined in largely Italian terms, became prestigious. Now, allowing for some correction at the edges, we can apply a rough chronology to the Renaissance. Down to about 1370, we see individual geniuses, but little that ties them together, and little that looks like a movement. Down to the 1470s, we have a Florentine period, or great things were done by Florentines and by outsiders resident in Florence. Beginning in about the 1450s, we can speak of the reception of the Renaissance in Rome, Milan, and Venice. And after 1500, the Renaissance crossed the Alps, and the movement became more decidedly courtly. Now, let's turn to the Renaissance in the North. Now, there was a psychological parallel, I think it's fair to say, between North and South. Man was a flawed creature, but perceptible by effort. And by struggling, by working, and by studying, by learning, man could improve himself. Now, there are two fundamental reasons for exploring the Northern Renaissance, and you can explore the Italian Renaissance more fully in your textbook. It's a matter of considerable interest to see what happened to the Renaissance movement when it crossed the Alps. The Northern Renaissance also stands in crucial respects as the intellectual background to the religious reformations of the 16th century, which we'll talk about later. Now, the so-called New Learning struck deep roots in the north of Europe, but looked quite different from its Italian manifestations. Now, it's important to see that lay culture was different in the north. It was less urban, it was literate, and it was affluent. It's also important to recognize that the church was more influential in intellectual life in the north, and that the scholastic tradition was more deeply rooted and persistent. In the north, we speak of Christian humanism, a movement that had much in common with Italian humanism, but also some important differences. As in Italy, the clarion cry was ad fontes, or to the sources. But the sources were more likely to be the Bible and the Church Fathers than the Greek and Latin classics. Northern or Christian humanists shared the Italians' conviction that reading and study were paths to improvement, that one could become like the persons one read or read about. Now, there was a psychological parallel between the North and the South. Man was a flawed creature, but perceptible or perfectible by effort. Protestants and Catholics would eventually divide on this point. Both North and South laid great stress on free will. Humans were free to choose the path of improvement or to reject it. Now, here again, Protestants and Catholics would eventually disagree on this issue. Now, once again, we're going to use a series of portraits to sketch some of the main themes and issues in the Northern Renaissance. Jacques Lefebvre d'Epal was the most important of the French Christian humanists. He sometimes used the Latin form of his name, Jacobus Faber. Now, he took a doctorate in Paris in the traditional learning and then traveled widely, including a stint in Florence in 1491 to 92. On his return to Paris, he lectured on Plato and Aristotle and began devoting to philosophical text the kind of scholarly scrutiny that he encountered in Italy, but that had previously been applied to literary works. Soon, Lefebvre turned to the texts of the Church Fathers, especially the Greeks, and in 1505 he published a translation of the works of John of Damascus. In 1512, he published commentaries on Paul's epistles and brought out in stages a French translation of the Bible. And in 1521, some of his teachings were condemned by the Sorbonne, and he fled to Strasbourg. The Reformers claimed Lefebvre had one of their own, but he never accepted their central doctrines. Now, John Colet, from a wealthy London family, received a fairly traditional education at Oxford, but was unusual in his day for having spent a period in Florence studying with Pico della Mirandola and Marcello Ficino, the great Platonists. From 1496 to 1504, Colet lectured on St. Paul's epistles in Oxford and began to apply the textual, critical, and philosophical tools of the humanists. In the process, he cultivated a deep dislike for scholasticism. In 1505, Colet founded St. Paul's School in London, which quickly became influential, and it remains a very good school to this day. Colet was only a devotee of the new learning, but he was also critical of the abuses and corruption of the church in his times and spoke out on a variety of issues. Colet was friends with great figures such as Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus, and his teaching and writing had a significant impact on the English reformers under Henry VIII. Now, Thomas More has been so much more romanticized that it is difficult to get at the historical figure. He came from a solid middle-class London family and entered the household of Cardinal Morton at 13 and began a lifelong study of the classics. His father desired him to study law, and he did so. Brilliantly, he was called to the bar in 1501 and even taught law for a time. Now, in 1504, More entered Parliament, but his political career began in earnest when Henry VIII became king in 1509. More held a series of increasingly distinguished positions until 1529 he was appointed Lord Chancellor of England, and he was in touch with, indeed friends with, most of the great intellectual figures of the day. Now in 1516 he published his most famous work, Utopia, a semi-satirical account of an imaginary place run according to natural law and simple logic. The book parodied many contemporary situations. When Henry VIII initially opposed Luther, More prepared the theological treatises that issued in the king's name. He was current with the best Christian humanist scholarship and defended it both against scholasticism and obscurantism. For example, he wrote to the Oxford authorities who wished to prevent the teaching of Hebrew to say that all learning was useful and important, and that only the small-minded could claim that teaching Hebrew was Judaizing. Finally, More broke with the king over the matter of royal divorce and was executed for refusing to compromise. Now, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam was the prince of humanists. He was obscure origins and educated in modest schools, then by the brethren of the common life, among whom he became acquainted with humanism. Erasmus became an Augustinian canon, and was ordained a priest, but not permission to leave his monastery to study. Now, for many years, he was an itinerant scholar, studying in Paris, Louvain, Oxford, and Italy. And he was taught by Colet, influenced by the Italians, and befriended by More. Now, his early serious work was on the Greek text of the New Testament, of which he prepared a Latin translation and eventually a new Greek edition. Like Lefebvre, Erasmus wished to make the Church Fathers more widely known and prepared. Editions of Jerome, Ambrose, and John Chrysostom, among others. His humanist leanings are clear in his Ages, a collection of Greek and Latin proverbs and pithy sayings designed to serve as guides to right conduct. In 1503, Erasmus published his Enchiridion, a handbook, literally, to instruct those in power on how to reconcile Christian ethics and the exigencies of office. Erasmus became a master of satire, and his two greatest works were The Praise of Folly and Julius Excluded. In the former, Lady Folly naively speaks on behalf of many contemporary ecclesiastical abuses, and in the latter, Pope Julius II arrives at the pearly gates where St. Peter does not recognize him and will not let him in. Now, in his later years, Erasmus had a battle with Martin Luther on the human will. Erasmus held to the freedom of the will and the Christian humanist ideal of improvement. Although he contributed to the Protestant movement, Erasmus would not join in, and even so, the Catholic Church for a long time suspected some of his teachings and rejected others. Now, bearing in mind that such men as John Wycliffe and Jan Hus had already challenged church teachings, that the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism had damaged the papacy's reputation, and that conciliarism had emerged as a new way of thinking about church organization, one can see how the Northern Renaissance paved the way for potential religious upheaval. But the people we met here would not cross the line into rebellion. Others would do that. This is the end of today's lecture on the Renaissance, with a little bit of the Italian and the Northern Renaissance. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. This is History 104 with Professor Hasselman, and I look forward to speaking to you next on the Protestant Reformation.